Thanks very much for having us today. It's been a great conference so far, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from all of you as we go forward. As has already been foreshadowed, we're going to talk to you a little bit about our work at the Climate Change Committee, in particular our most recent adaptation progress report, but also some of the exciting stuff that we've got coming in the future, which my colleague Karina will talk to you about a little bit more. But critically, I think what we're really interested in talking about is how we can work with all of you to continue to improve all of the work that we're doing in this area, making sure that we're really drawing on the broad breadth of knowledge there is on infrastructure and data in this community. So very pleased to be here. In this presentation, we're just going to talk very briefly about kind of who we are, as in case some of you are maybe not familiar with the work that we do, and then, as I mentioned, talk about our most recent progress report, and then ways that you can get involved in some of our forthcoming work around the fourth climate change risk assessment and other things coming out in the future. So very briefly, we are an independent arm's length body established by the Climate Change Act. We have statutory roles advising the government on climate change mitigation, which I think a lot of people are a bit more familiar with that work around carbon budgets, mitigation progress reports. How is the government tracking on its goals to reduce emissions? But what we're going to focus on more today, where Karina and I work, is on the adaptation side. So how are we adapting to the effects of climate change that we're already seeing or likely to be seeing in the future? And I think our work is maybe a little bit less known in that area. We tend to think of our involvement in this as there being a bit of a cycle of adaptation policymaking in the UK, which involves first at the top of the cycle assessing risks, which the government does every 5 years, and then developing plans for how it's going to deal with that. And we feed into that in two ways. We produce independent advice that the government can use for its climate change risk assessment every 5 years. That's our next forthcoming piece of work that Karina will talk about more in more detail. And then we also produce progress reports assessing how each of the governments in the UK is tracking on adapting to climate change. This is our most recent product on the adaptation side. So we recently produced a report on adaptation in England for devolved powers and UK-wide for reserved powers. We've got another one coming out for Scotland in October next year. Of course, we are not the only people involved in this process. There's many people, including all of you here, who produce information, research, data that is really essential to keep this policy cycle moving. So quickly on our adaptation progress report and how it might be relevant to all of you. It is a cross-economy assessment that covers a whole range of different topics. As you can see here, we've got several on infrastructure, around water, energy, telecoms, and ICT and transport. I guess I just want to flag here that this is what was covered in our latest progress report. Going forward, we have expanded this a bit, so we're now going to be looking at water and wastewater explicitly, and we've also added waste to this list going forward. So those are kind of the infrastructure sectors that we'll be looking at in the future, but this is what was covered in our most recent progress report on the infrastructure side, along with, as you can see, a whole range of other areas as well. When we're assessing progress on adaptation, we use what we call a monitoring map, which looks something like this. I've included our latest example for water. We are in the process of kind of refreshing these for our next reports coming forward. So if you do have any feedback on them, we'd love to hear from you. But what we look at is kind of at the bottom, there are your contextual factors. So that's things around your, as we saw in the keynote presentation today, around your hazard, exposure, and vulnerability to understand our climate risk, as well as kind of broader contextual factors around population growth and change, things like that. We then look at what kind of policies need to be in place and whether those are in place to make sure that we're laying the groundwork for adaptation action. The enabling factors, so a key aspect of that always comes up is data and monitoring. Do we have the data? Are we tracking it? Do the right people have access to it? Along with a whole range of other enabling factors. And then, of course, importantly, you get to your adaptation actions, what you actually want to see to improve adaptation in the system. So that's kind of the framework we use for assessing progress on adaptation. And according to the Act, we provide scores to the governments in two different ways. One is on delivery and implementation towards all of this, and one is on policies and plans. So what are we looking at going forward? Do we have the right plans in place? But also, how are we delivering those? How are we tracking on implementing those plans? These were the scores in our latest progress report. As you can see, there's a tiny bit of green, but not a whole lot. We do have a lot of work to do. A real strong message across infrastructure, but actually across all different sectors across the economy, is that while there are gaps in policies and planning, the bigger gap is in translating that into delivery and implementation on the ground. However, one critical factor on this that I would really like to flag is that is only based on the data and information that we're able to track down, what we can find, what's available to us. So sometimes we do think that there may be gaps, things that we're missing because we don't have the data here to be able to tell us a fuller picture of what's actually happening on that delivery and implementation side. Diving specifically into infrastructure, these were the scores we came up with. And I guess one of the things that I would really like to highlight to this group, where we've got things like unable to evaluate, that's where we did not find sufficient data and information that we felt we were able to provide a score to Parliament in terms of how delivery and implementation of adaptation action was taking place in that sector. So we do definitely have gaps, but again, there may be data out there that people in this room are aware of and have access to, so we'd really love to hear from you if you do have access to any of that information. So today I'm not going to dwell hugely on the findings. The report is out there. We're happy to answer questions as well. But what I'd really like to talk about is a little bit about our use of data and some of the challenges we have, and maybe where those of you who I will say are undoubtedly much more expert than me will be able to possibly help us out. So I've grabbed a few examples from our energy, the energy part of our report, and the data that contributed to those delivery and implementation scores there, to illustrate maybe some of the challenges, but also some of the things we've learned throughout this process. So first off, this is one of the indicators that we track quite regularly around number of severe weather customer interruptions for energy. And as you can see here, it's kind of all over the place. It's really hard to understand a trend here. And one of the real challenges we have, what we think the reason behind this, is weather-related customer interruptions and how that's tracking over time. That's influenced by a whole range of factors, probably most significantly changes in weather. Not every year, the weather is very different year on year. So without being able to weather correct this data, we can't tell how much of this is due to changes in weather year on year versus what contribution adaptation action or lack thereof might be having here. So we'll come on to it later. We've got a bit of a survey for you and some questions, and would also be very keen to have some Q&A discussion, but very keen to hear from all of you around methodologies for weather correcting data that you might be aware of, or weather corrected data sets that we could maybe look to so that we can improve our analysis in the future. But this is a challenge that we've got across sectors as well. It's a really common metric that we look at across infrastructure sectors, but it makes it very challenging to separate out the different factors that could be contributing to this. On kind of more positive news maybe, for the very first time in our last progress report, we were able to provide scores on managing interdependencies, which is one of the areas we track and provide scores for. For the first time, we actually got our hands on some data. And again, a lot of our data is kind of proxy. It's not always 100% clear. Again, as we just talked about, there are challenges with it, but we managed to work quite closely with Ofgem to get some data on the number of critical customers supplied by substations at risk of flooding. Critical customers are your kind of critical national infrastructure facilities, or things where if there was an adverse impact to it, if something happened, you might have to evacuate communities. So we're talking about things like your water supply, the things that are fundamental being relied on. And as you can see, there was a significant drop in this, and I think this goes a bit to the role of incentives in trying to change outcomes. There were targets set for companies to reduce this as part of the price review process. So we can see that that contributed to quite a significant drop. A lot of companies, in response to that incentive, implemented flood protection measures. But this was one of the first times we could actually get our hands on data tracking adaptation actions, addressing interdependencies between infrastructure sectors. It's usually something that, from our experience anyway, you all can tell me if I'm wrong, is not tracked as much because there isn't an incentive, like there was in this case, a financial incentive to help reduce those interdependencies that other sectors may have on a particular sector here, energy. So it is one that we really struggle with. But again, we're really keen to hear your views on where we could find more information about this. And with that, I am going to hand over to Karina, who's going to talk to us more about, that was a bit of kind of what's already come, but we'd like to talk to you more about where we're going, things that are coming next, and how you can get involved.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So just very quickly, a bit on the work ahead for the CCC, which is under the umbrella of the fourth climate change risk assessment. So as part of our independent advice, the CCC will produce 3 outputs as a bundle. The first one being the technical report. The technical report basically analyzes the climate change risks and opportunities, and is led by a consortium of academics and by the Met Office. So the key question for the technical report here is, what are the risks that need to be managed? The second output that the CCC will produce for the first time is a well-adapted UK report. And what the well-adapted UK report sets out to do is analyze which actions are needed to respond to the risks identified as a part of that technical report. And finally, a statutory advice report that sets out what administrations should do to ensure the actions are delivered. So it's a sequence of sort of identifying the risks, then setting out what are the key actions, the key adaptation actions, and finally, what can be done in terms of policy levers to put those actions in place. What are the opportunities to for you here today to get involved with this work? We're in that frame, as I mentioned, under the fourth climate change risk assessment, so the CCRA4, which is maybe a bit of a handful for those who are not familiar with the abbreviation. But what's coming ahead and down the road is essentially an opportunity to get involved with that technical report that is being led by a consortium of academics and the Met Office. The technical report is currently being produced. There will be an interim version that will be open for community review in November. A second opportunity for the room to get involved with our work ahead is with the well-adapted UK report, which we're currently in a phase of evidence gathering. And we would love for people in the room to help us gather some information. For that, we've added a link here on Mentimeter. Essentially, we're looking for indicators to track adaptation progress in infrastructure, thinking about existing indicators and existing indicators to track progress is not always easy. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the limitations of the adaptation data, but we're interested wherever you as experts have come across data sets that are weather corrected, for example, or weather corrected methodologies, linking it a bit to what Rachel talked to you earlier about, that would be great and very useful for us. So we'll leave that link on the screen for a little bit more, and also our emails, if that's a preferred way of communication. Essentially, that will get you to a Mentimeter survey where you can answer a few questions. You don't have to answer all of them, but there are a few, hopefully, that you can point us to some resources.